Tivo is basically a very specific VEG-F receptor tyrosine kinase inhibitor. So what you can see from, this must be the pointer. What you can see is it requires roughly an 8-fold increase in concentration to hit something other than the VEG-F receptor. And I think in the end, that's what makes Tivo special. It is also interesting that it has a long half-life. So one of the nice things about Tivo is once you get the patient on the drug for about a week, you have relatively nice steady state levels. I think you're all familiar with the pivotal trial that was presented to the FDA in 2012, 2013. It was a straight-up comparison of Tivo to sorafenib. It won on PFS 12 months to 9. But unfortunately, due to a one-way crossover and the fact that many of the patients who enrolled in places like Russia and the Ukraine, where second-line therapy was not readily available, there was a discordance, and overall survival favored the control arm because majority of patients got 2 lines of therapy compared to the active arm where they got Tivo and then often on to hospice therapy. But nonetheless, a straight-up, and I would also argue that at 12 months, this is as good first-line data as any first-line data. Since we've been talking a lot about Cabo today, if one looks at the Cabo-Sun data where progression-free survival in the intermediate and poor patients was 8.6 months, in that same Tivo trial it was 9.2 months. And in fact, there was a few extra poor performance status patients. And well, we have it later, but again, the data also, our second line data, again, these were the crossover patients. Ultimately, there's 161 of them, and with progression-free survival of 11 months based on an investigator, it's certainly better than Meteor at 7.4. But what actually makes Tivo special is the specificity and the adverse event profile. So our dose-limiting toxicity, shame on me, wrong button. There we go. Our dose-limiting toxicity is hypertension, presumed to be an on-target effect. So for the off-target effects, we have very, very low rates. This is, the top number is all grade, the bottom number in parentheses is grade 3, 4. But compared to basically everything else in the field, the only number on this whole chart that's better than Tivo is that one. Sorafenib has a slightly lower rate of fatigue compared to Tivo. But when you're looking at numbers like 23% versus 72%, 19% versus 86%, this is just a much better tolerated TKI. One thing we look at a little bit, and it's an attempt kind of to have a composite endpoint, which is to ask the question, regardless of what the adverse event is, because for some drugs it might be hand-foot, for another drug it could be fatigue, how often does the doctor have to do something? Well, the number of times the patient has to reduce or interrupt the treatment for adverse events is dramatically lower for Tivo than it is for anything else in the class. So what are we doing? As the FDA told us to do another study, we chose to do basically the same study again, only this time in the third line. So it's, again, a head-up comparison to sorafenib. You can ask why sorafenib. 2 reasons. One, we had third-line data so we could actually plan. I'll show you that data in a second. But also, we were specifically trying to draw parallels to Tivo-1 because it's our hope that we can rescue Tivo-1 and get a broad first and third-line indication. I do want to point out something else. We're stratifying by prior regimen, and there are a substantial chunk of these patients who've had PD-1, so this will probably be the first randomized data set with patients who have failed checkpoint inhibition. Couple things here. One, this is the control arm. This was that failed Davitinib study where progression-free survival was 4 months and overall survival 11 months. This is the crossover patients who, if you will, screwed up Tivo-1 because they did so well. But again, if you look at 11 months of progression-free survival, it's certainly better than the AXIS data or the Meteor data, and overall survival rivals that for Cabo. That's redundant. The other thing we're doing is we've been talking lately especially about combination therapy. I would argue that the biggest issue for considering an IO combination with a TKI is going to be adverse events, and specifically overlapping adverse events. Toward that end, we've started the Tinevo program. This was a relatively small phase 1-2 study being conducted in France by Bernard Escudier and colleagues. Whoops, shame on me. One more time. There we go. We blew through phase 1. There were no dose-limiting toxicities. We only have 2 dose forms, so it was easy. And we've enrolled an additional 22 patients at full dose Tivo plus full dose nivolumab. And this is some preliminary data we presented at the ASCO GU meeting. Make a long story short, only, where is it up there? 52% of patients had a grade 3 adverse event, of which 44% were considered to be drug-related. I think this is probably as good safety data for a checkpoint plus TKI data as you're likely to see. And then from the activity standpoint, 9 of the first 14 patients have responded. So at a PR rate of 65%, we're right there in the ball game with everybody else. And majority, obviously, was a preliminary report, and most of the patients are still on study. And we hope at ESMO to have data on the full data set. So to be quick about this, one, we have a highly selective VEG-F TKI with unsurpassed efficacy. I would actually raise the question, are you really sure that Axel and MET are adding anything? We certainly have best-in-class safety profile. You may know that we recently used the original data from TiVo-1 to garner approval in the EU, so the drug is currently currently available in the UK and Germany and Austria while our partners work their way around the continent. We think we have the ideal agent for combination therapy. The actual trial, the TiVo-3 randomized trial, is fully enrolled. We're just waiting for the requisite number of events so we can do the primary analysis. And we think Tivo presents very, very promising data for future combination work. Thanks a heap.
So do you think that, again, combination is going to be, where you want to go kind of in the future, especially in the United States? I mean, is that, there's obviously the data looks good. We see it, but, with where the market is, with where it's going, where would you like to kind of take this to get it, out there?
So there are some practical limitations. The practical limitation is if we don't have a partner from an IO company, the cost of buying the antibody is prohibitive. So just to be very specific about it, when we think about a clinical trial, a registration trial, seat of the pants costs us about $100,000 a patient. So an 800-patient trial is $80 million. If I have to buy Ipi-Nivo for both the control arm and the active arm to do Tivo, Ipi-Nivo versus Ipi-Nivo, that will triple the cost of the study. So instead of $80 million, I need $240 million. The market cap of my company is right around there.
Why do you need that if Ipi-Nivo's approved?
What?
Why do you need that?
Well, first off, if we're going to do it outside the U.S., we have no choice but to provide all the investigational product. And truthfully, we tried Tivo-3 to start, at least in the U.S. only, using commercial product. We had a couple of patients who either got refused by their insurance company for the sorafenib, got refused by the insurance companies, or we then said, well, we're willing to provide it for those patients whose insurance. IRB said either you do for all, you do for none. Within about 2 months, we basically were providing sorafenib for everybody. So I don't think the days of using commercial product for a registration study, I think that ship has sailed. So that leaves us with what can we do? Well, one of the things we've been thinking about is a second-line study where we do Tivo plus minus Nivo. So let's assume you have a patient who's failed immunotherapy in the first line. You would expect Tivo to be active. The question is, does adding immunotherapy add to Tivo? That's a study we can do because I only have to buy the Nivo for one arm, and it's a smaller study. But that's a big issue. And you can imagine we're constantly talking. If you have influence with any of the owners, anybody's got influence with BMS, we'd love your help. But we think we'd love to do Tivo, Ipi-Nivo versus Ipi-Nivo.
So, Michael, question. So, if your Tivo 3 trial is positive, Tivo beats sorafenib in the third line. I didn't really see exactly the eligibility criteria. Did you have patients who had to get on the trial? Did you have patients who had Nivo and progressed on Nivo?
Right. So we had
were all these patients IO naive?
Yeah. So the requirement was 2 priors, at least one of which is a TKI. We stratified into 3 groups: double TKI, TKI checkpoint, TKI everolimus. So those 3 groups are stratified, and so we will obviously be able to break out the data for those 3 subsets. If you think about, we enrolled that trial basically from the summer, 2 summers ago to last summer for the most part. So availability of immunotherapy in Europe was still relatively limited then. So there's probably,
what do you think is the percentage of patients who had prior IO on the Tivo 3? 25%?
Maybe 30.
Because, I mean, if it is positive, my question is, how relevant will then the data be? You want to be in the third line after, IO and Cabo, etc.
Well, again, a couple things. Number one, we're going to have we hope to have a first-line indication as well. And I would argue if you're considering for the favorable risk patients to give Sutent or Pazopanib, you ought to consider giving Tivo. It's just as active and has a better adverse event profile. If we're going to crack the intermediate poor group, we need some help to conduct that study.
So the other question I have, I mean, obviously you showed, results from prior therapies, prior trials with Meteor, etc. Obviously, we advocate not to compare across trials, but Tivo being a almost pure VEGF TKI and not targeting resistance mechanism pathways. So does that mean that all we've been thinking about MET and AXL and VEGF as relevant pathways for resistance, especially after prior angiogenesis inhibitors? So here is a more potent VEGF TKI who does well in the second and third line. And you really, we've been talking and lecturing about, targeting that pathway is not relevant. You just need a more potent VEGF TKI. What do you think?
So I may not be the most unbiased observer. I would argue that our data challenges the notion that MET and AXL are adding anything. I will point out 2 things. The grade 3-4 hypertension for Cabo is comparable to ours. Again, we think hypertension is an on-target effect. That's issue number 1. And I would argue that the efficacy itself suggests, the overall efficacy itself suggests that I think Cabo's a very good dirty VEGF receptor inhibitor, and Tivo is a very good clean VEGF receptor TKI inhibitor.
Okay. Last question. Preliminary results from the Tivo-Nivo.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see any liver toxicity like was seen with Paz and with?
There wasn't much. I got to find it here. There's elevated AST, one grade 3-4, 2 all grade out of 27. AST is in the same ballpark. It was relatively modest.
So it's more like axitinib when you combine it
Which,
with
by the way, is the second most selective. I mean, if we are the most selective VEGF TKI, axitinib is second, and frankly, the other molecules are all promiscuous. Appreciate the attention.